that on? Okay, looks like I'm getting audio now. Calgary, please let me know if you don't hear anything. Okay, hey, how's it going? I'm doing well. This is an exciting week. I like the final project week. It's pretty fun. I hope you feel the same way. So, you know, we can kind of come up with what we want to talk about this week, or we can ask you, and I didn't do that. But I tend to like to talk about Webpack. Has anyone not heard of Webpack? Okay, so we've heard of Webpack. Is anyone afraid of Webpack? No? Does anybody know it well? Okay, confused by it? Does anybody not know what it does or what the purpose is? You know, but you don't. Like it's just kind of there and it does stuff, and you think that it's good stuff because it seems to work, but we're not really entirely sure why we might make the decision to add this to our project ourselves. Okay, so that's what we want to talk about today. And although I am going to be speaking about something quite specific in Webpack, I want us to think about this from more general terms. For example, if I had to go and learn something new, how could I approach that? If I need to build large-scale web applications, you might need a pipeline of some sort, some way to get assets of one type into another type. It could be Webpack, but there are many different options out there. But I had to choose one. This is sort of the most popular one today. Okay, and I feel good about teaching this because I've been keeping an eye on it over the past year about how it's been improving, and it really has been improving. We've seen almost, by using Webpack, almost you know, free improvement in terms of the execution of our code and also like execution speed of our code, but also the size of our bundles. And by that I mean the amount of content a user has to download to experience our application. So, although I will be talking about specifics, remember, think about how you would learn Webpack from the beginning. I'm going to be talking about things that I learned while reading the documentation. The documentation for Webpack is very good. Find that Webpack, React have really good documentation. Anything that kind of matches up to that. In that ecosystem, it seems to set the bar high, so I'm actually noticing that a lot of other projects like Redux, for example, have really good documentation, and I think they're inspired by what they see coming out of Webpack and React and whatnot. So we will talk about Webpack. I'm also going to show you how to build your own boilerplate, and that means that you might not ever have to use someone else's, which I think is a positive thing. So who started with a boilerplate? And that includes Create React App. Okay. Everyone, right? And it's because it's easier to do it that way, and kind of gets us started quickly. And why should we learn maybe all these extra things that don't get us necessarily that much closer to the specific product we're building? Yeah, let me know afterwards whether or not you feel more comfortable maybe doing some of this stuff from scratch. So the main thing, Webpack, what we use it for, it's a module bundler. Okay, this is what it does. Is it bundles up our source code into something that the browser understands as a bunch of modules. Now, when you use Node, this concept is built into Node, right? When you npm install a module, you're bringing that code, you're creating a dependency on that code. When you say something requires this, that's a dependency, right? So we get to define our dependencies quite easily in Node. But with JavaScript in the browser, we haven't been able to do this for very well, or at least not built into the language. So that whole require thing that's in Node, that comes from something called CommonJS, which was something that people created as a JavaScript library as a way to solve this problem. They said, well, we need a way to, when we create a JavaScript file, we want to define what dependencies this code has, and we want to do it in a way that dependencies always get loaded before the code that uses the dependencies, right? For most of what you've been doing so far in the client, you just take those script files and you put them in the order to make sure that they are loaded in the order that they are needed. But a module bundler helps us with this, makes us not have to think about that. We might actually only include 1 or 2 script files, and they will be built in a way that they can be, the code is loaded as it's I guess, as the dependencies define it. So these dependencies, with import is actually the new ES6 way of doing dependencies. Am I walking out of the, yeah, I'm kind of, so ES6 added the ability now for us to do dependencies through the ES6 modules. That's import and export, those terms. That's new. So not all browsers support it, and so we might need to still define our dependencies that way, but then build up a piece of code that the browser actually understands, not just the browsers of today, but the browsers of last year that we still care about. Maybe we don't care about the ones from 5 years ago. So eventually, we're actually just going to be able to use ES6 modules if we want in the browser. Not necessarily. Maybe these bundlers won't be as useful for that. Okay, so all these dependencies, script files, things like handlebars, maybe templates, SAS or CSS files, these could all be dependencies. And we define those dependencies through a number of means: import, require. Also in CSS, whenever we do an @ import or a URL, when we're trying to link to something, those would also be considered dependencies. And Webpack starts out at a single file that you give it. It says, I want to start at index.js. And from that point, it actually creates a graph. You can imagine what this graph might look like. If your index file imports React, well, then there's one link on the graph that points to that library, that module. And you might have a bunch of other files that point to that as well, but there's only going to be one version of React in your application. And then you import a component from another directory locally in your file system. That adds that to the dependency graph, and it makes sure that that code is available before the code that you actually want to run. Finds a CSS file, and we need to do something with those CSS files, so we might bundle them into their own JavaScript module or extract the text and load that as a separate file. The point is here, once we created this dependency graph, we want to take that and convert it into static assets that the browser understands. And usually that comes in the form of a JavaScript file, a CSS file, and then maybe a number of images, maybe fonts, those types of things. Those static assets that the browser, it is built into the browser to be able to read these things. That's not true for things like JSX and SCSS, right? The browser does not understand JSX. It does not understand what SAS is, or sort of this layer on top of CSS. So we have to. That's one thing that we get from something like Webpack, is we can actually transpile the code. We can change it from the source that we like to write to the source that the browser understands how to read. Okay, so that's two things: manage dependencies, and also convert our code to something that the browser actually understands. When you read the documentation, I love how they put it, because, again, Webpack is this really big thing that does a lot of great things, and we only need to really learn about this much to get started. The 4 core concepts of Webpack, and they call this out right on their documentation. 4 core concepts include inputs. That's the code going into the pipeline. Outputs, that's the assets that are coming out of the pipeline. We've got loaders, which take care of transformations. So a loader will take your ES6 JavaScript code, and as it goes through the pipeline, convert it to ES5 JavaScript so it can be run in the browser. That's what a loader will do for us. Or it'll take our SAS file. As it goes through the pipeline, it'll get transpiled into, let's say, CSS instead. Maybe all you want is you don't want to change an image. Maybe you want an image to stay the same size and the same compression and everything. But maybe you want it to move to a different location. And I'll show an example of that. A loader can also move files around if you want. Lots of things loaders can do, but it can't do everything. So we also have this idea of plugins, and plugins are there to do everything that loaders can't. So most of the transpilation happens with loaders, but I'm also going to show you a couple of plugins that we can use that are a little bit more powerful than what the loaders provide. Okay. So again, inputs. Webpack calls this the entry point. If you go look at your Webpack config, or if you have one, if it's not hidden from you, there's going to be an entry there. There's something, a property called entry, and it's going to point to the very first file that you want Webpack to start searching your dependency graph for, or to create the dependency graph from. It's kind of what this looks like. This is the object version of this. So entry can be a string. It can be an array of multiple strings. It can be an object. And the object allows us to actually give, there's a little bit of benefit here. I get to name my entries. So I could have more than one entry if I want. In this example, I only have one called app. But I could name them, a few of them if I wanted to. I could have maybe one entry for my application, one for certain libraries, split those up into a couple different files. We don't need to get into the complexity here. Just imagine having one entry. And this could just as easily be written as entry : path.resolve, dir_name index.js, that whole thing. That could be just a single entry point. In that case, it wouldn't be named, but that's okay too. Okay, so there's this concept called emitting. So when you run Webpack, it says these files were emitted. That is really what the outputs define, is where those files go and what they're called. So this might be what it looks like for an output. We just want to provide a file name. In this case, it's going to be called app-generated, and it's going to go into the JS directory of whatever my output path is. My output path is going to be called build. For you, it could be called public. It could be called static. It could be called dist. There's lots of different names for this. The point is that this is a folder that contains only generated files that I could delete at any point, that I don't commit to version control, and then I could build very easily. Right? I can just build these. I run a command, and it takes my entries, puts them through the pipeline, and gives me my outputs, puts them into a specific directory that I can then serve over HTTP through maybe my Express static site, or from some Rails assets directory. I can do that as well. So these are cool. The loaders are really cool. And Webpack, the team there responsible for Webpack, they build their own loaders, but you could build a loader. Anyone could build a loader. And there's lots of people that have built loaders for specific things. For example, one loader I saw, SVG images, SVG files, which is like scalable vector graphics. We can actually define images through what looks like sort of like an HTML or XML syntax. Pretty useful. What if we have a bunch of these SVG files and we want to use them as icons? One loader might actually convert our SVG files into React components for us. And we don't have to actually write a specific React component for every icon that we want. We just have a folder called icons. Put that folder through this transformation. Out of it comes a folder full of React components that are icons. That could be, I've definitely seen that before, a component for that, or a loader for that. So most of the time, though, Babel loader is going to convert code for us. Sass loader is going to convert CSS or SCSS and Sass files into CSS. There's a thing called file loader. It'll copy files around for us. It'll emit them to our output directory for us. It's kind of what it looks like. I know they're called loaders, but in the configuration, it's a module section, a key called module. And there are a number of rules. The rules is an array of different rules we have for how we apply these loaders to different file types that come through our system. If it ever finds an import for an SVG file, in this case, it'll use a file loader, and it'll copy that SVG into the output directory for us. Okay. I will show examples of all this, so this is just, again, an overview. All right, I said plugins do everything a loader can't do. That's kind of a cop-out for me. But really, here's an example. I said file loaders can copy files around only if they're in the dependency graph. What happens if I want to copy files that are not actually referenced in my source code? I could use a Webpack plugin that will copy maybe a bunch of PDF documents from one folder to another for me so that those can be served to my customers, to my clients over HTTP. A few other plugins we'll go through today as well. So I would argue that while boilerplate does serve a purpose, we can get away from it, that we can learn a little bit about Webpack and actually start to take ownership of the maybe take ownership of the boilerplate we started with, instead of just saying, well, I'm kind of stuck here. If someone does not add this feature to this boilerplate, then I don't get to use it. And I think that's sort of the wrong approach. And a lot of the boilerplates that exist today kind of fall into one of these two categories for me, too old or too complicated. Too old just means was too specific maybe, was not used by enough people, and as a result became out of date. Maybe it's an older version of Webpack that's still there. If you were to use one of these, you have to bring it all up to date. Upgrade things. You'll definitely want to do that. Keep that in mind. Check the versions if you're going to use someone else's boilerplate, especially if they haven't committed for a year. That could put you, quite a behind in the technologies that you're using. Another side of this could be that the boilerplate could be too complicated. I've definitely seen boilerplates where you have to learn a whole bunch of configuration to configure the boilerplate to do what you want it to do. And I would say if that's the case, you should spend that time learning something like Webpack rather than that specific boilerplate, because chances are Webpack will be used by a whole bunch of different companies, but that boilerplate might be used by one. And so you've sort of maybe limited what you, and you got to use the time. So hopefully today you're inspired to, I guess, dip your toes in a little bit. So when I'm coming up with what I want my project to look like or what I want it to be, I guess there's a few things I have to figure out. I want to figure out the requirements for what my source tree looks like. This is actually pretty important to me. When I'm working, when my team is working, I want it to be pretty predictable where certain files are, and I want to define what that directory structure looks like. Now, I don't think that you get to do that a lot with boilerplate, because I think that boilerplate comes with this already. Create React App says this is how you structure your application. It has some opinion about that. This is where you put your styles. This is where, for me, I want to decide that. I want to get together with my team, and I want us to figure out what works best for that. And actually, to be honest, every project that I work on, you'll look at it, and you'll see the directory structure is a little bit different. Because I felt at the time when I was creating it that that project was a little different, and they all are. So here's the example for today. All of my JS and JSX files are going to go into a JS directory. I'm going to have an SCSS folder that's going to contain all my styles in it. An images directory, I'll just put assets that I want to be able to use in there. Fonts directory, it's going to be a custom font, maybe. You won't have to do that a lot. You'll just use Google Fonts. But I want to show you how that's possible. Because it is possible that someone comes to you on your team, in your company, and says, hey, we just spent $10,000 to get this font created, custom font. It happens. It's our brand. Maybe you need to now serve a custom font, one that does not exist on fonts.google.com. Webpack allows us to manage some of that. And then I'll have my index.html, which will be sort of like the I guess, template or it's the place where we're going to mount that React app, right? And so we need to define what that looks like, where that app gets mounted, and we do that within our index.html file. So this is where all my source goes. And then very similar, my build directory, the one where I serve assets from, is what it's going to look like. It's going to be very close. The only real difference here is that instead of JSX files, I only have JS files. And instead of SCSS files, it's converted to CSS. So I'll put them in a CSS directory as well. These are the files that someone would download to use my application. And these are the files people would modify to write the application. Okay. The other thing I want to do is I want to define what my requirements are. And by that I mean sort of like technical requirements and also workflow requirements. And so if we go into my notes here, yeah, I've talked about the directories here. Mainly, so these requirements. Just go through this yourself and think, like, what do I want to do with this project? I want to use Sass to write my style sheets. Okay, that's cool. So that means that I have to change my boilerplate or my pipeline a little bit to support that. I want my CSS to be in a separate file rather than embedded in my JS bundle as a module. Does that make sense to anyone, or is that kind of confusing? Does it make sense to you? So what does that mean to you? Okay. Okay. Yeah, so for Calgary, Ben was talking about maybe you want to separate out CSS because it's not really JavaScript, that it separate those concerns out. So when I'm talking about this, it might not be very clear to people because it has been sort of hidden from us. You have done the opposite of this with Chatty App, for example. So Chatty App, what it did is it took all your CSS, converted it into a string, and then put that string into a JavaScript file. And when your app loaded, it would take that string and then put it into the DOM. So it would create a style tag in the head for you, document.createElement, style, puts it in the head, and then takes that string that's in JavaScript, using JavaScript, and injects it into the head of your document. So that would be the opposite of this. Your CSS is not a separate file. Your CSS is a bundle, is a module, just like every other JavaScript file bundled into your application. So some of the reasons why you might want to do this, one, if I have a lot of CSS and that gets bundled into my JavaScript file, now my JavaScript file grows in size. I have to download that entire JavaScript file before any of my styles are applied. That could be a poor experience for the user. So I would say one of the main reasons to separate CSS is to reduce bundle size, to split the amount of your code out and make it sort of cheaper for your users to download. And also, it does take time for a computer to parse and compile JavaScript. Every JavaScript file has to be parsed and compiled sort of in real time or at runtime. And so if you don't include your CSS in there, a big chunk of CSS, then it does not have to actual parse and compile that part of it, and that could improve the speed that your application starts up. So there's some good reasons for this. I'm going to show you an example of both. I'm going to start by bundling it into the JavaScript file, and I'll show you how it gets included in the style tag. And then later, we'll extract that and put it in its own file. Okay. I'd like to write my JavaScript using ES 2015 features. I think that's true for everyone. I don't think there's any reason to write anything kind of older in your source code. We should be using ES6 as much as possible. But we want to still deploy to Internet Explorer 11, so we need to transpile our code. I'd like to use JSX syntax for my React components. JSX is, I think, one of the best parts of React, to be honest. So I want to use that syntax. You can write React without JSX, but who wants to do that? So we're going to add that as a requirement. We're going to say that we need some way to transpile JSX into JavaScript. I'd like to use a custom font. I kind of mentioned this. So in a situation where a company wants to use their own font, well, we might have to add that to our pipeline, emit that to the output, and serve that font from our own servers rather than a import from a fonts.google.com site. And then also I need a React mount point for my application in my HTML. It just means maybe a div with an ID of application or something like that, something that we can render that first component into with React. I'd say that's a requirement. If we're using React, we need something like that. There are ways around it. I can dynamically create that. Maybe if we have some time at the end, I could show you how to do that. But what I've done is I've really identified what my boilerplate needs to support. And now I could go out and I could start searching for things that support this already. And if I find something that matches this exactly, maybe it makes sense to use that. But what if it uses less instead of Sass? And what if it uses Webpack 1? Like, where are we then, right? So hopefully this gets you past that. And at least if you start with a boilerplate, you're not handcuffed by it, that it does not prevent you from making progress. That would be very important to me. Okay. So I've got this application. I'm going to git checkout master first, just show you what it looks like. I think it's just npm. Let's just do dev client. Oh. I don't know what happened there. What is this? Close. Almost had to figure out what was going on there. So I just installed modules. This is what we have today. So it's a very basic React app. There's actually not a lot to it. If we go into the React panel, it's an app. That's it. Just one component. We can look here and see that all of our, oops, oh, come on, network. That's the one. So when I load this thing, a whole bunch of different assets are loaded. We start with localhost. Localhost sends back this index file here. This index, or this, oops, come on. Let me drag this up. Like, why not? I just want to. That's stupid. Okay, let's try. If you come out here, can I do it a better job? That's a bit better. Okay, so the first thing we have here is localhost, and that really just, that's our first request, right? It's a GET request to localhost. So what we're going to get back is most likely an index.html file if we're serving static documents here. And that's what it looks like. This is a file that was, it has gone through the pipeline, and it added generated files. It added this generated CSS. It added a link to that for me, figured out where it emitted it, and then added it to my index. And then same with this one here, this JS generated, the app generated JS file. Also added that for me. And so it's saying here there's a JS file called app generated JS inside the JS directory. There's a CSS file in the CSS directory. And then here's where the React app gets mounted. Okay, so this is my index file. When I load this, we also get app-generated.js to load, right? Because of this link here, it's going to load this file. This is all of the source code for this project, including all of React, including my components, and any of the dependencies that existed in here. So let's bring this up in size. That's what this file. This is my only component. When I, but I do have this index.js. So this is actually my entry point here. So it goes in, it finds React as a module, brings that into the bundle. Finds the render method from React DOM, brings that into the bundle. Finds the app.jsx, brings that into the bundle. And then it renders to our document, where it gets that app here, and it renders that component into it. Now React is running. There's also, so when we mount this app component here, we see that there's actually an image tag with a source images webpack.svg. So I would expect that I would have a file in an image directory called webpack.svg that this can use. And sure enough, that was what loaded right here. This webpack svg file was loaded as a result of that component being mounted and it having a source to an image file. So that caused that to load. All these fonts here, when our style sheet's loaded, I don't know why we actually don't see them here. That's kind of interesting. We should see the style sheets here somewhere. Oh, there it is. I don't know why it wasn't showing up before. So yeah, it loads as well. When it loads, it gets it actually has a link to the TrueType font files. And then that's it. So those are all the assets that load. And if I do a ls here, we'll notice there's no build directory in this folder. npm run dev build. This is going to actually run Webpack and build the assets for me. This is going to take those entry points and emit a whole bunch of different files. We see that right here. These are all the files that were emitted by Webpack. They went into a build directory. That is new. That just got created when I ran Webpack. And now if I go into that build directory, that's starting to look like that build output directory that I had. And if I go to JS, there's an app generated JS file in there. And if I go to fonts, here's all my fonts, right? So this is actually the directory that's created by Webpack. I can, anytime I want, remove it and then just run Webpack again to get that directory back. So this actually goes into my git ignore as well. I don't commit this to version control. All right. So I'm going to revert this. I can just get rid of the package lock.json and oops. Oh, actually. Okay. Git checkout live. So I'm on this live branch now. If I npm run dev client, oops. Oh, npm run dev. Okay, that's why. So it's building. Now I'm using Webpack dev server here. Actually, I think Yeah, that's not going to work. I guess I do build. All right. So I'm going to try and build this, and I'm going to get some issues now, because my project is a little bit different than what I just showed you. There is still an app.jsx file, so my React app is still here. Still an index file that does, that's my entry point. But what we're going to notice is inside my Webpack config here, it's empty. So nothing exists in this file yet. And that means that when I try and build this, I'm going to start to get some errors, right? Because here it's telling me there's a warning. I have not set the mode yet. So Webpack requires us to tell it what mode we're in. Is it development mode or production mode? Those would be the two main different modes. And it's going to act differently based on the mode that you're in, because we actually build our assets different for development than we do for production. Some of the differences might be source mapping. We might source map different in production and development. In development, we want to get access to our original source code when we're debugging. So we do maybe a really big source map that allows us to do that. In production, maybe we only need a little bit of debug support. We don't want to give away all of our source code, perhaps. So we do a little bit of a slimmer source map. So the way that Webpack can figure that out is by the mode. And to make things easy right now, I'm just going to think about development mode. So my mode is development. And normally we can configure that, but this is going to get us started. We can configure this different based on how we run the build. But for now, we're just going to run it like that. So it's giving me another error here. It's saying an entry module not found. So these errors, they can be confusing at first, for sure. What it's telling me when it can't resolve something is it just can't find this file. And I'm trying to think, why is it looking for the directory called source? I don't have that. I don't have that in here. Webpack has defaults. By default, the entry point, I believe, is a file called main in the source directory. I think, or maybe it's just an index file. I don't know what its defaults are. I like to set them. I want my entry file to be this file right here. I want this to be the first file Webpack looks in to create its dependency graph. And so I need to tell Webpack that that's the entry point. And I could just set up my directory structure to be what Webpack uses by default, but then I'm losing control on that. So I will tell Webpack, don't look in a source directory anymore. Okay? I'm going to change where it looks. And that means going into my Webpack config and adding an entry point. And whenever I do file stuff or point to different files in my Webpack config, I'm going to start using this path library. The path library is going to help me because I don't know whether or not someone is running this on Windows or Linux. And in Windows and Linux, we have different ways of describing paths. Those might be two different ways to define a path, right? And so what the path library allows me to do is just say, this is sort of what the structure of the path is. You figure out if we're on Windows or Mac or Linux or whatever, and you put the slashes in for me. You put the C:, in for me, whatever it is. Like, you build that absolute path for me based on what you know about the operating system, and I will just define the pieces of it, right? So here we would say path.resolve, and we actually get a bit of a shortcut in Node. We can say the directory name the directory we're currently in. So this is actually a location of this Webpack config file. And I'm going to make everything relative to that. I'm going to say that relative to my dir name, I want to create a build directory. Or sorry, I have a client directory, and I want to grab the client.js index.js file from that. This is kind of going to be, or this is going to be what we get from this. Console.log. Path resolve. We'll just see what that full path is. Oh, these ones, you see what you're saying, yeah. I think this is join, right? Actually, I'm not. Yeah, so join we would actually take each of these pieces, join them together, but I believe resolve goes through and helps me with this. I think so. I would have to confirm that, but I've definitely been using. I think I've only been on Linux, so no, I've run all my stuff on Windows too. I don't know, but I've run it on Windows subsystem Linux. I don't know the answer to that. Let's look at it after though. But I think the point of resolve is to actually do that conversion for me. This is my output here. When I console log that, this is actually the absolute path that Webpack will use, which is actually pretty useful, right? So we can see that the only part I added was client.js index.js, and dir name actually represented this Webpack notes directory that I'm in. And that's actually where my Webpack config file is. So again, I'm making it relative to that. Now, where does double_dir name come from? Sorry? It's a node thing, yeah. So let's do a quick example here. I'm just going to create error.js, and I'm going to throw new error here. I don't know, dir name. Okay. So it's kind of weird, a file that just throws an error. But what's cool about this is we actually get a little bit of insight when this happens into the code that Node actually uses. Oops. See this? That's code that I didn't write, but that Node wrapped all my code in. Right? I wrote this. Throw new error dir name. And this is actually what Node, how it wraps its modules up, is it creates a function. And it wraps your code into that function. And that function protects the scope of all the variables in there, right? Makes it so that you can't accidentally necessarily create those globals, right? Exports require module.exports. That stuff doesn't just come out of thin air. It's passed into this function for you to use. That's why we can say const path equals require path, is because require is passed into the function that we don't actually get to see, okay? So is file name. That's the name of the file that we're running right now, the file that the module represents. Dir name. It's the directory of that. And that's what we're actually using here, is the directory name of the file that we're loading into Node. Yeah.
With that leading parameter, that means that the entire, like, every time you run code, it's just like a giant loop.
Every module is, put into a function and executed that way. Yeah. Okay. So now we've got that entry point. Let's see if this actually, it kind of worked in the sense that we made progress. We didn't get it to, it doesn't work, it's not finished, but we made progress because it's no longer complaining about not finding that file. Now it's saying it did find that file, and it found an error in that file. And the error says, I don't know what this is. This is an unexpected token. I mean, it found a character that it didn't recognize as being sort of something that it would do that you can do in JavaScript. You may need an appropriate loader to handle this file type. And here we are. Maybe it's this one. It's ES6, right? So if ES6 is not supported, we need to add support, and we do that through a loader. We need to transpile this code. Anytime you see you may need an appropriate loader to handle this file type, we're going to add a new module rule to our configuration to handle that type of file. Let's start off by adding our first rule. Okay, this is an object, and it has a test. And the test is really just what is the type of file, and they use extensions for this. So we can say here that a JS file or a JSX file will run through this transpiler, and we could say a JSX file, or so this would be one way to say JS or JSX file, right? We say that that X is optional. We could say JS, JSX. So this is just a regular expression to match different file extensions, okay? And we want it, sorry? So anything that would be at the end of JS, probably. Yeah, I usually do it this way. And here, what we're going to use is something called the Babel loader. Now, Babel.js, it's the compiler for next generation JavaScript, I put in JavaScript that looks like this, and out comes JavaScript that looks like that. Okay, so I can convert my arrow functions, my destructuring, all that stuff can be converted into ES5. We're not going to use Babel directly. Like, we can just take our code and run Babel and have it output a JavaScript file that's been transpiled. But it's only one small part of it that we want to do. So we're going to actually let Webpack manage that. And we're going to use something called the Babel loader. Now, Babel loader is an interface that Webpack can use to allow Babel to do the hard work. So Webpack doesn't actually know how to convert JavaScript. It doesn't have any code inside of it to convert JavaScript. It delegates that responsibility to Babel through the Babel loader. I'm going to install the Babel loader. Now, since I last did this, Babel has released their latest versions of things. I have Webpack 4 here, but I think what I'm going to try and do is install Babel loader from, I think, the newer version. So you're going to notice that there's a current version and then there's past versions. So just make sure your documentation these days are 7.0 and higher. That's going to be the newer version of Babel. We're going to check to see how to use presets for this. I guess we can see. I don't know if Babel loader. It's been a little while since. Yeah, so they don't have the. They don't talk about Babel loader here because it's not really a Babel concern. That's a Webpack concern. But if I go to Webpack Babel loader, we can go to the actual documentation for this. And so here we're going to be using Webpack 4, Babel loader 8, and Babel 7. That's kind of confusing because the old version of Babel loader is 7, but the new version of Babel is 7, and the new version of Babel loader is 8. Sorry about this, not my fault. I'm just going to take this part. I'm going to say that we need these two things in order to start using Babel. We need the loader, that's the interface between Webpack and Babel, and we need Babel core, which is actually the code that understands how to transpile things for us. Okay? So I would npm install this. Oops, I guess. Just paste that. And once I've done that, I can actually now use this loader called Babel loader. Okay. So now when I run this, let's see what we get out. Yes, of course, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So is that saying, like, I read through this, I was expecting to find something, and I didn't find it? Because if I saw that error, I would go to line 6 instead.
Yeah, so let's look at line 6, because it might be talking about this right here. It might be talking about not knowing how. So one thing I've noticed is that things will change, and at some point import may just be supported naturally. We might not have to do anything more for that. But something like this I don't expect ever to be supported by Webpack because it's too React specific. Right? So I think that, yeah, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's most likely that when it talks about 6, 7 here, it's talking about this, which is actually JSX. But either way, we need to use Babel loader. We need to transpile this file. And so these steps would be the same. Is we'll tell Babel loader, because Babel loader actually has something called a React preset, and it's what configures Babel to understand the JSX syntax that we've been using. And it converts all the JSX calls into React.createElement calls instead. So I just noticed something here. I don't know if I copied, let's see, package JSON here. That's what it says, yeah, but here's 4. And the reason that happened, I'm just going to make my, I'll just copy this. I'm going to get checkout. I'm just going to get rid of this stuff, and then I'm going to merge master into here, of course, and get Webpack 4 going. Because I guess, so what I did is I upgraded my master version, and then I never upgraded the live version to, or I never upgraded, or merged to the live version. I guess what I could do is always all right, get status, get check out. No, get merge abort. Okay, so I'm going to get checkout master. I'm going to get brand. No more live branch, okay, get let's say checkout dash B live. That should be better. There's Webpack, okay, good. So I'm going to install Babel loader and Babel core again, and then in here, there we go, I'll just save that. Okay. That should be better. Then we'll take a break in a few seconds here after I get this one working. Probably would have been just faster to type that, right? I see what happened, and I also didn't merge that change, so it's dev build now. Vim or npm run dev build. Good. All right. Oh, that's nice. That actually pointed out more specifically what we're talking about. That looks like a Webpack 4 thing to me. Just doing that upgrade actually improved this error messaging. Okay. So let's get it to understand what this means, and we'll continue by just configuring our Babel loader here. The next step is we need to go and use a preset. There's actually this preset here called preset React, and so we would just install this, and then we can use it. So we'll install that, and then down here we actually provide options for this. One of the options is presets, and that would be an array of presets, including the, think of that, Babel. Check it out. It says Babel React preset here. Okay. So this is a configuration for Babel loader. You may have noticed that there was something called a Babel RC file in your Chatty app. I think there was. Babel RC is another way for us to configure Babel. It's just a configuration file Babel uses to say, what presets do I have available? What plugins can I use? Plugins allow us to do things like object spread operator, for example. If we want to merge an object, we can do something like obj and then some new key. Right, and that would take all of the values inside object, put them in this new object, and then add a new key to it. Well, that does not exist in JavaScript. It doesn't even exist in ES6 or ES7 or ES8. It exists in a future version of JavaScript that we don't have yet. And so we might want to use that still It's the presets and plugins that allow us to do that. It's the plugins that might be configured to find that piece of code and say, I know how to convert it for you. So this part here is definitely project specific, and it also always depends on the types of features of JavaScript, the ones that don't exist yet that you want to use. They go into this options here. Does it depend on what framework you're using? I mean, some frameworks might require certain new features of JavaScript. I would say that they're less likely to do that, but it's possible. It really comes down to the new features of JavaScript you want to use. So they actually have this concept here called stages. Okay? So, oh, well, here's a good example. Class, field, property, TC39. So this is the TC39 is the council that puts together the JavaScript language. So here's a proposal. The proposal is to do these things called class fields. I think, yep. So x equals 0. Okay, so I can, in a class, in a component like this, I can just say x equals. This is not in JavaScript at this point. If you try and do this in, I think, Node today, it won't work because Node supports JavaScript, well, but only standardized JavaScript, right? Actually, that's not entirely true. I think it supports whatever it wants. I'm not sure if object spread works in there or not. But you know, yeah, and I don't think you need to transpile for that. Same with, well, I don't know so much about the class properties. But you know when you're doing, you want to bind, you don't want to bind anymore, and so you say, well, I'll just create these arrow functions inside my class. So you do something like, I don't think they have an example in here. Maybe my app. It's not even a class. So I do like class component or something extends component. And then I say I want this like handler, handle click to equal like that. If you want to use this, then you need to use this proposal, because this does not exist in regular JavaScript. So you need to have Babel convert this for you. That's why I don't teach it automatically. That's why I don't teach it at first. Is because then I have to talk about transpiling and TC39 and potential future changes to JavaScript. So that's why I don't recommend it as my first option. It's not officially supported. Okay. But by going in here and saying, I want to support class, fields, Babel, and you, here's a proposal for class properties. I can use this as a plugin to now transpile this part of the language into something that the browser actually understands. Okay? I don't need that for this project, so I'm going to leave it out of there. I'm going to leave the preset React in there, and I'm going to try and build now. All right, this is, I think, good news. Well, let's, I will upgrade Babel while we take a break here. It's basically just saying, yeah, we don't need this anymore. What I'm going to do is RM, RF node modules. Good, gone. Just going to delete that. I'm going to get rid of some of these things. I will be installing all of these as we go along. And I will have to upgrade this to Babel 7, I guess, live. Okay, so let's try this. Just npm install. It's going to take some time. Let's have a break, come back, this will be done, and then we can use Babel 7. We should keep going. I fixed that issue. Basically, I wanted to do that upgrade to Babel 7, and it was still had some references to Babel 6 stuff in it. So I fixed it, and now when I run my build, I get a different error now, which is good. So it's gone through, and we added this preset React, so now it's actually able to convert the code for me. If it actually built the assets, then I'd be able to show that to you, I think. We still don't have those here. Is that right? Oh yeah, we do. It's right here. So let's see if it actually. It's not very pretty to look at. Here. Here's my function app. Okay. That is the function here. That's this here. And then this function returns something. What does it return? First thing it returns at the highest level is a div. A child element is a div, right? And then that div has another child that has a class name tagline. If I look through this code here, I can see that this is a React create element call. And React create element creates a div, and that div has a child that is a div that has a class name tagline. This is what happened when we transpiled JavaScript, JSX to JavaScript. And this is what the preset React did for us, was every time it found something like this in a JavaScript file, it switched it to that kind of thing for us. Right? Question? I believe that's these new lines here, isn't it? I'm not sure. It's like it actually, well, I think it actually generated like legible JavaScript. And now the reason why this is all, I think this is all a string that's put into a module. It's put into a module as a string and then evaled, right? So it's just, you can call eval on a string and it'll run it as JavaScript code. So I imagine these new lines are because this code actually is meant to be, if it were converted and maybe not put into a module, it would, you just get a JavaScript file that had all the new lines and some formatting that you could read. That's probably why it has those new lines in there. Eventually, this will get minified for production, and all that stuff would be stripped out. So I'm not too worried about it in this case. A lot of this stuff, yeah, could be ripped out of here. Okay, well, notice that actually, it actually output this file to the distribution directory. That's not what I wanted. I wanted it to be in a build directory. So I'm just going to set up my other configuration here for output. The file name is going to be, I'll just start with bundle.js, and I think the second one was path. And here I'm just going to use path.resolve double underscore dir name, and that's just going to be build. So now when I run this, I should get a build directory here now. Build directory good, bundle JavaScript file. It's that same file. I've just told it I want it to be in this location now. Okay, we'll come back to that. We'll change that a bit more later. But at least this way we can kind of check that file out every time we try and build it. Okay. Huh. Should get rid of that too. See, look, it's complaining. It says it does not know what this means, because we can't just create properties in a class unless we add that plugin that allows us to do it, right? And this I won't need in my project, But again, this is just an example here. Support for the experimental syntax class properties isn't currently enabled. And so in order to enable it, I would install the preset, use an npm install, and then I would add it to my preset configuration for Babel so that it would know how to handle this. Even tells us which plugin that is. Right here. It's pretty cool. All right, we got this other error now. And that's because in my file here, it's trying to import something called application.scss, but that's not a JavaScript file. It's a different type of dependency. It's a CSS file. So we want it to load. We want it, when it finds this at import here, to know how to handle that. There are 3 loaders we're going to want to use for our style sheets today. There's something called the CSS loader. That CSS loader understands how to follow URL requires, for example, understands how to handle SCSS files, because again, this is a JavaScript bundler, so we have to help it out with that. We're going to use something called the style loader. That's the thing that takes our CSS and injects it into the style tag. The test that we're going to do is actually on SCSS files, right? So we'll say that here. This could be now either SCSS files or just CSS files. The S is now optional. So if it found CSS files, it would still put them through this loader. Found SCSS files, it would still put them through this loader. I could potentially do either SCSS or SAS files, because there are different ways for people to create these files for us, or that we could create these files if we want. I'll leave it like this because what I need for my project. The loader that I'm going to want to use is actually 3 of them, so I'm going to use an array here. The 3 loaders I want to use: style loader, CSS loader, and SAS loader. So I'm going to use all 3 of these loaders whenever I come across a file that's either SCSS or CSS. Happens to be this file, for example. I will now npm install style loader, SAS loader, CSS loader, and node SAS, which is similar to how Babel understands how to convert JavaScript. Node SAS knows how to convert SAS for us. But Webpack doesn't know how to communicate with Node SAS, so we use a SAS loader to do that. So SAS loader uses Node SAS to actually do the transpiling of the SAS files for us. Okay. Builds that. I run npm build, see what our output looks like. And now it's no longer complaining about, well, that other error here said it didn't know how to handle this @ symbol here, and it does now. We provided support for SAS, which is where import comes from. Right? I believe it does. Now it's a different error, though. Different, actually, bunch of errors. And it looks scarier than it is, because there's a whole bunch of them and a lot of red. But they actually all kind of say the same thing, which is, I don't know how to handle these font files. I don't know what that means. So we need a loader for this. Like when we try and include, and these files here are included in my CSS, this is a dependency. Right? My CSS has a dependency on these font files, and we define that dependency right here. We say we're going to do a URL load on this fonts Merriweather dash light italic, regular italic. I mean, I'm using SAS, so this actually generates a bunch of CSS for me, 1 for each font. That's pretty useful. Check that out if you want to see more, I guess. So when it runs into this, it's saying, well, I'm trying to load this TTF file. I created a dependency for it, but I don't know what that means, and so I need to define what that means in my Webpack config. This one is just a static file that I want to be able to load. So I'm going to use if I find a TTF file, then use, well actually I only need one now, the file loader. Okay. File loader is going to take the file here. It's inside of the fonts directory. It's going to take this file, this file, this file, all these files, and it's going to emit them to the build directory for me. It's going to copy from the source to the destination, which is my build directory. And the reason why I want to do that is because I don't want to serve my client directory. I don't want people to have access to that. So I need to make sure that all the files that they need for this application are contained inside this build directory. File loader, just like all the other loaders, needs to be installed. So we do that. Install file loader. And so now, when we run dev build, and it finds a true type font file, it knows how to handle it. And this is what it did, is it emitted each of those files to my build directory. Now look at this. This is one of my true type. Which true type font file is this? It's hard to tell, right? Because it actually applies a name to it, a name. It's a hashed name, so it hashes maybe the contents of the file and makes that the name. And you're like, well, but that's, how does my app know how to find that? Webpack goes through your JavaScript, and any reference it had to that file puts the right name in there. So if we go to bundle.js here, there's that font. Knows how to access it by name. And any link to this, it's actually linked here. Anything that linked to the fonts Merriweather Black file is actually using this module to get access to it. Okay. And same for all these fonts. So I don't want to use that. I want to kind of name these things a little different. So I'm going to actually use the loader, file loader, and then options. And I think, I just want to make sure I get this right. Most of these options, so file loader options, I would just search, that's how I would search to find out. I'd go to the file loader page here, and they're going to give me a nice little list of these options. The options are, well, actually this one gives me, I don't need to use context. What I want is this one, so name, so I'm going to look for name. Here's name. Name is a string or a function, it looks like. I'm just going to name it. Default is hash.ext. Does that make sense? We can actually use these like templates here and say, I want to use the hash of this. I want to use the path. I want to use the name. I want to use the extension. So I get to define that the option here for the name, how I define what the name of the font is, it's just going to be name.ext instead of hash.ext. So now, when I build this, it's going to output. It's going to output the files with the names that I just gave it instead, based on their original names. And now when we go into the bundle file here, it doesn't have hash names anymore. It exports the names that Webpack gave it through that configuration. So I think this is a little nicer because I can then recognize which font it is. So we'll leave it like that. That's a good way to do it. Okay. So we're not getting any more errors here, which means we've built our client-side application. And if I want to, I can serve this build directory, right? So I've got this server here. This is a very simple Express server. Right? This Express server, we require Express, we create the app, we can set up our port and our environment based on the environment variables if we want. They default to 3001 in development. And then here, what does this do for us? app use express.static build. That's right, yeah. So anything that's in the build directory is accessible through this build directory now. So I could say localhost colon 3001 / bundle.js, and it would give me this file back. And if I did / merriweather-black.ttf, I'd get this file. So I'm going to run that server. I think it was just, for this, I think it's just, we can just prod server, sure. npm run prod server. Now it's serving my build directory. When I go to localhost 3001, cannot get /. Why is that? Build a root for it. So what do you mean by that? Right. So, well, I mean, I have this build directory. I mean, that should handle serving my app, right? So by default, if I try and ask for a directory, what does it actually look for by default? HTTP servers or web servers. Index HTML. Yeah. So I don't have an index HTML here. And if I were just to say instead bundle.js, it serves that just fine. But if I try and say index.html, which is what it would get by default if I don't have any other path there, can't find it. Okay? So I need to have an index.html inside here. And the index.html I want is right here. This is where my mount point is. This is where my React mount point is. And so I need that for sure. I also need this basic HTML because that's something that, this could actually serve. So what do we notice is missing from this? Script, right? Script. There's no script tag here, but I'm not going to add that because Webpack knows what the name of the script is, so I'm going to have it do that for me. This is where we get into our sort of last of the 4 core concepts, which is plugins. HTML Webpack plugin. That's what we're going to look up. And we'll go to the GitHub page for this. Plugin that simplifies the creation of HTML files to serve your bundles. That sounds pretty good to me. That sounds like what we want. So I'm going to, I think I'm going to install stable, and I might pay for it. We'll see. So I'm going to npm install HTML Webpack plugin. And the way that we use plugins in Webpack, at the top we just require it. So there's HTML Webpack plugin. And the last, so I've got mode, entry, output, module. Remember 4 concepts, so I've got inputs, outputs, transpilers or loaders, transpiling. And then this last piece here is plugins. And this is an array of plugins, and I need to create a new instance of the HTML Webpack plugin. Okay. Now if I do this, I don't know what's going to happen by default. Let's just see what we get out of this. In my build directory, I got an index.html. That's not bad, but the problem here, what's it missing now? Like I've got the script, that's there. I don't have my styles, but my styles are actually in my bundle right now. Yeah. That's right, I don't have that div to mount my React here. I want this to have a div ID app kind of thing, right? So what's kind of cool about that plugin is by default, it just creates an index file for me and puts it into the build directory. But by default, it doesn't know about the React thing. So what I might do is instead use this index that I have in my source directory as a template, and it will use that template and build the index from the template. Okay? So I look at my configuration here for this, and I'm going to go down. I can set the title, so what would be the title of my page. I can set what the file name should be. By default, it's index.html. I can see that here, so I'm going to leave it. Template, though. This would be a path to a file that it will use. So template, that's just some configuration for this. Path.resolve, dir name, and where is it? It is in the client, it's the client index HTML. So client index.html. Now when I run this, and then we go take a look at that build file, now it has all the things we need. It's not just the mount point, it's not just the script, it's the script and the mount point. And again, this was added by the plugin as it went through the pipeline, but it started with my index.html, which had that mount point. Okay, so now my bundle, my build directory has an index.html, which means I should be able to serve index.html, which I did, and I can just go to the root / and this seems to be working pretty well. We're not done yet, but when I load this page, I get that response with the HTML. It's coming from my index.html. I get bundle.js. I can change the name of that in a few here, but what I'll do is fix this issue. Cannot find webpack.svg. Why is this? Why do I get a 404 not found? SVG plugin or another copy. Yeah, so I could use an SVG loader, something that knew how to take SVG files and emit versions of that, or maybe bundle it into my JS file. I can actually bundle all my SVG into my JavaScript if I want, but with that comes the overhead of all of my SVG being in my JavaScript. So maybe I don't want to do that. Maybe I only want to bundle small SVG files, anything less than 8 kilobytes. That's something people do. Because there's a balance here. You could have one really big request, and that could take a long time. You could have many really small requests. That could take a long time. But if you balance it out and have a good combination of sort of medium-sized files and a few requests, then that's probably going to be optimal. And so here we're actually going to keep the SVG files separate. They're going to get loaded from this build directory, and we just need to make sure that they're in this location. So we could use file loader like we did for TrueType fonts, those copied. But the problem with file loader is it requires that you actually have them as a dependency. And in my app.jsx here, I don't technically have a dependency on webpack.svg, right? Now, there's a way to do it, to add a dependency. Import, let's say, webpack logo image from, and then I can say images. Has anyone done that yet? Like import a file. Okay, so this is totally fine. We can do that. And then here, instead of using the hard-coded source, and then Webpack says, oh, I know what that file's called, and it adds that in there for you later on when it builds it. But this is now a dependency, so this could go through a file loader, and that would be fine. But let me show you how to also copy files that do not have a dependency, because I think that's entirely possible that that will happen. I could imagine maybe a directory full of PDF documents that you actually don't have links to them maybe in your application, but you still want them to be in your build directory. So for that, we would use a plugin. We would use another plugin, one that understands how to copy files. I'll just undo that. The one that we have for that is copy Webpack plugin. And this is cool because you kind of just give it an array of patterns to match. And this is what a pattern looks like, from to. And you can do a whole bunch of different things like relative and absolute paths. You can do globs and all that. So you can. Mine's going to be pretty straightforward. First thing I'll do is npm install webpack copy plugin. And then, just like every other plugin, I need to require it. So const copy webpack plugin is equal to, and then I'll just require that file. think that's right. Is that right? Copy Webpack or Webpack copy plugin, Webpack copy, yeah, okay. So now I've got this copy plugin, and plugins require us, this is an array of all the plugins we want to use, so we're going to create a new instance of that. And copy Webpack plugin, remember, it takes an array of patterns to match. And so you can actually copy from here to here, and here to here, and here to here, and if you want, you can define multiple patterns. I'm going to just do one. From path.resolve dir name, and I'm actually looking for the client images directory. That's where I want to copy from. And I'm going to copy to an images directory in the build folder. Okay? And the reason why I did that is because in my app here, I know it's looking for something called /images webpack.svg. So that's only going to be found if it's build/images webpack.svg. That's how the web works, right? Okay. So let's run this now. We'll build, and we'll see if part of the emitted files that we had include. Oh, no, that's weird. From dir name client images, that should be fine. To dir name build images. Did it copy? Let's see. No. That's that. Oh. That's something here. Webpack copy plugin. Something's going on here. So maybe I didn't do my Webpack copy properly. Let's see. I'm sorry? That's a good question. I mean, I was pretty sure I didn't have to. So here's copy plugin. Well, this is what I had here, but I should be able to use the path. Oops. Let's try this. Not sure why. I'll have to look into it. If that no, it's still giving me that issue there. Option dirs undefined. So maybe this is a new version. Definitely didn't have to do this before, so I'm going to look at what dirs is. Doesn't like that. That's going to be on there all over the place. So is it? Oh yeah, interesting. What is this options thing that they have here now? This is, okay, yeah, this is pretty new, I think. Let's see. So the way that I'm going to find out about this a little bit is by looking at the history. It's not that, you know what, it hasn't been changed that recently. So something's going on here. Oh. Huh. This happens sometimes. I think this is the problem. Totally different module. Like, definitely. What's Webpack copy plugin? So, we want copy Webpack plugin. Okay, let's do that. That's going to make it easier on us, I think. All right. Let's try that again. So that means that we need copy Webpack plugin here. You know, it felt wrong to me because it didn't follow this pretty loose standard that I've noticed of, you know, some identifier dash Webpack dash plugin. It was going the other way, and that felt kind of weird to me. But didn't stop me from doing it anyways, huh? All right, let's see that now. So there, that's better. I'm not getting that warning anymore. It's the right package, and the most important thing here is it actually found that image in the images directory and copied it. And if I had 30 other images in there, it would have copied all of them because I did a copy from images to images. So everything in this directory to this directory here. Okay. So now when I run this web server here, and I go back, and I reload, now it's looking pretty good. I've got no more 404s, I believe. Network. No more 404s. Found Webpack, finding these fonts. So I want to do a little bit of cleanup here. First thing I wanted to do was go back to my requirements and make sure that this satisfied all those requirements. So first requirement was, here. I'd like to use Sass to write my styles. So we know we added the loader for Sass. It converted it. My source documents here, I'm definitely using Sass. But when I get my output and I look for, there's a bunch of CSS in here somewhere, let's see. It's in here. So like this is where my CSS is right now. I know it's hard to read, but this is took all the contents, all the text contents of my CSS and put them into modules for me. And when I look at my code now, my project here, and I'm going to just pop this back in over here, and I look at the elements. Remember what I said? This is my style tag here. This is all the styles that went through the pipeline, got put into a module, and when my page loaded, the code does document.create element style, head.append that style tag that you just created, inner HTML or whatever inner text equals, puts all that text in here, and that's what you get. And that's why you see all the new lines in that module, is because this is what we're actually getting out of it at the end. So I would say that this satisfied my first requirement, which is that I can use Sass to write my styles. That's good. I'd like to, so what about the second one? I would like my CSS to be in a separate file rather than embedded in my JS bundle as a module. I haven't done that yet, so I need to readdress that. I would like to write my JavaScript using ES 2015 features. Now, this is getting kind of old because ES 2015 is pretty built in now. I mean, 2 years ago, maybe not, but I'd say this year it is. I will tell you, though, for example, we need to find maybe an arrow function somewhere. I don't know if they have them. I don't believe this is doing any transpiling. Like if we were to look at our JavaScript right now, it should all still be ES5 or ES6 stuff, because we didn't convert it back to ES5, and it's running fine until maybe we try and load this in Internet Explorer 11. So I'm going to show you another quick preset. This preset here is called env. And it's Babel preset env that will do the transpilation from ES6 to ES5. I'm just going to install this quickly. And I'm going to add that to my configuration here as one of the presets. It's not just React that I'll do. I'll also use the environment preset for ES 2015. So I've satisfied that requirement now. I'm able to write my code in 2015 with 2015 features, but it will still run in 2012 browsers, right? I would like to use JSS syntax for my React components. I've done that. That was because I used the preset. It's able to convert that stuff. I used a custom font. Two things there. My Sass defines which fonts I want to use, but my file loader copies the fonts into the directory that the client can access them at. And then I need a React mount point. That was, I created an index.html with all the stuff I needed inside of it, and then I used it as a template, and I used the HTML Webpack plugin to inject the scripts and then copy it to the build directory for me, to emit it to the build directory. So I'd say the only thing that I haven't done so far is this CSS in a separate file. I'm going to use another plugin for this, and the plugin is called Mini CSS Extract plugin. I don't know why it's Mini CSS Extract plugin. It used to be called Extract Text Webpack plugin, but since version 4, this is what we're going to use. Yeah, it doesn't. I thought maybe Uglify doesn't do that. Yeah, you're right. It's probably includes that if you run it in production. So I'll just install Mini CSS Extract plugin, and then at the top of my file, const mini CSS extract. Awesome. And this comes in two different parts. The first part is the loader part, because I need access to all the CSS that's going through the pipeline. And so instead of my style loader, I'm going to use the Mini CSS plugin loader. So this is actually just coming from their documentation. Here's the loader you use. It's the one that comes from this project instead. And so this is actually using 2. I'm going to use 3. I'm using Sass loader, CSS loader, and then the Mini CSS extract plugin loader. The second part that I need is to actually add this as a plugin to my project. So I need to grab this here. And as the third plugin that I add, it'll be this one here. And I want to just call this named, we'll just call it name.css for now. So when I run this build, let me see. That's because it is. It's just complaining because I used the wrong case, because I copied and pasted it from their documentation, but I used uppercase in my own require. And so look at this, main.css. Okay, so if I now run my server and I load this, it's not going to look different, except when we dive in here and see, oh, there's no longer a style tag. It's actually a link tag now, and it links to main.css. So I've satisfied that requirement. My CSS is actually in a different file. It's no longer in my bundle.js anymore. It's in my main.css. I'm going to, instead of calling them main, I'm going to call my bundles app. So I can do that here by just using an object instead of a string. There's now a named entry point. And the output file name is no longer to be bundle.js. It's going to be name.js. So maybe app.generated.js. Maybe I'll call this one name generated.css. So I'll have app.generated.js and app.generated.css. I like calling them generated just so that I can delete them without even looking what's inside. Right? Just kind of tells me what it is. I run the build again. And I run the server. Should still work fine, but now it's loading up app-generated CSS instead. My build directory, though, still doesn't look the way that I originally designed it, right? I wanted a JS directory. I wanted a CSS directory. I wanted things to be organized. So that means that here, I'm going to say this goes into the CSS directory instead. And I guess also my JS should go into the JS directory. So I'll put that here. Okay. So I'm going to delete this build directory. You should never feel worried about that. If you ever feel worried about that, we've done something wrong with it. And I build again. And so now we'll look at the build directory. It's looking a little closer. I don't have these fonts in their font directory yet. So let me look inside of the file loader how I can actually specify the path to copy to. File loader. Look up the documentation for this quickly. And we see that there's an option called output path. Okay. So I put that output path here. And I'm going to say that this is the fonts directory. Try building it. I'll try building again. And now, there's a fonts directory. Now you might ask, well, why are these still here? It's because it doesn't remove them. Those are the old ones that were built before. So I would remove my build directory. I guess I did it the other way before. So rm build, then build my assets. Now that they're built, I can go to the build directory. Here's CSS. Here are the fonts, images, and my JavaScript. Right? Okay. So when I run the server again, prod server, I look at the network tab and I'm noticing that there's actually an issue here. It's having trouble loading these fonts now. So sometimes when we make, sorry? A new path. Well, yeah, so where is it trying to load this from? Yeah, and the reason it's trying to load it from CSS is because inside here, it's using a relative directory. Right? And because this CSS file is in the CSS directory, when this tries to load, it's going to try and load the CSS fonts Merriweather Light file. That doesn't exist. And we don't necessarily want a CSS fonts directory. We want a fonts directory. And so what we would ideally want is just for this to load like so, right? But then that becomes a problem because in my CSS here where I define those fonts, I want to put this, I want this directory to be relative to where the fonts are from this file. So I've kind of run into an issue here, but my pipeline will help me with this. One of the things we can use is actually a property here called public path. And we're going to just configure this here in our output. We're going to say that the public path is /. Okay. So now when I build this, and I run it, no longer have this issue. These fonts are loaded from the fonts directory. And when I look at app CSS, where is it? App generated CSS. They now have these /s in front of them because we've set that. Oh, wait, I guess we'll reload that, right? That's kind of cheating. Let's load it up again. That was just, here, it's this one. There. This is not the one I modified. See, we can actually see it's on all of them now, not just the two that I modified. So it's Webpack that added this for me. And now it knows how to find that at the root level. That's what we wanted. So sometimes you need to configure this public path for such reasons, okay? Now, that's everything that I wanted to cover sort of officially today. I've also, for anyone who wants to go work on their project, that's totally fine with me. I won't feel bad. I will spend another 10 or 15 minutes going through development, some things we could do with development, and then also how you could set up for production a little bit. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. So the question for Calgary is it this index.html that is is it providing the right anchor tag or? So the question is, have we hard-coded our index.html? And we haven't hard-coded it in the sense that we do not use this specific one to actually serve our content. We use this as a template. Webpack, the HTML Webpack plugin, takes this template, injects the scripts into it. The things that Webpack emitted, it knows the location of those things, and injects the script. That's why if I take this index.html in my client directory, it does not have any reference to scripts, because I don't know it's called app bundle.js in the JS folder. Right? That shouldn't actually be a concern of mine at this point. But this is inside client. But then when we copy all of this to the build directory, and it goes through Webpack plugin, then we get this index.html, which is slightly different. And you can call build public if you want. Yeah. Then the only difference is I'd have to go in here. I'd have to change this to public. And then in my server, I would go in and I would change this to public. And then you would have a public directory. I call it build. That's sort of maybe just something I was used to. So yeah, so you could have two of these folders, right? For me, I'm just taking I put all my source assets, including all my images and stuff, inside this client directory. I might actually have a static folder inside the client directory that has static files in it. What I don't do though is commit things that are in my build directory because I want to be able to delete that build directory anytime I want, right? So what this allows me to do is copy anything that I need, even if I don't need to change it, into my build directory using Webpack. I called it build. Again, you can call it static or public or anything you want as long as you serve the right directory. And I only have one of them. Yeah.
This could probably be a question for later, but like the way that create React apps works is there you go the Webpack config.
Yep.
In the node modules, is there a way to like modify that without like injecting the app?
So the question is, can you modify your Webpack config if you use create React app? Can you modify your Webpack config without ejecting? And the only way is through configuration that create React app gives you. So no, you don't get to go in and configure React specifically. The way you do it is you eject. And yeah, that to me seems like you're just adding more complexity than you need, though, right? I think that ejecting Webpack and learning how much do we have to learn here to actually? If you look at my actual Webpack configs for projects, I mean.
Yeah, I mean the Webpack config itself is not the main thing. If you check then like any new updates to create React apps don't get included.
Yeah, I guess the question is, there's a trade-off for sure. Create React app. It's much better. I know their newest release is way better than what it was before in terms of configuration and stuff. Here's something for a project that I use. It looks pretty familiar. This resolve stuff is just so that I can do things like import flux from, and then something like that, where that's instead of me saying import flux from something like that, I can actually just create aliases. So that's not that much extra. Same plugins that we used already, same loaders pretty much. This is still using older version of Babel, so that's why you're not seeing @Babel before it. But my configs don't tend to get super complicated. I think using create React app is totally valid. I think if there's something you can't do through its configuration, which again is improved with their last release, then ejecting is not a bad option. But then you're taking responsibility and you don't really get to go back from that.
Yeah, I would have preferred to like kind of write this code myself, but in the interest of time.
Yeah, interest of time. That's a really good. I think for everyone's for the final project, they shouldn't be building their own Webpack config from scratch. And that's why I tend to do this a few days after you've started working on it, because I've definitely gotten the feedback that says, oh well, we ejected and it just made so much more sense after that. And we were afraid to eject before, but maybe now we're not afraid to eject. You know, you can always branch, eject, play with it, and then delete that branch if you don't like being ejected. It's only when you merge back that you have to then you should stay ejected, right? Okay. So I'm going to finish this off with a few small pieces here. You'll notice that I've been running this command dev build, which is actually basically the same as just node modules .bin webpack. So just running the webpack command. That's what this does. But I also want to run a maybe a development server. So in order to do that, I would npm install webpack dev server. And the command I use to run webpack dev server is actually just webpack dev server. So I can, once this is installed, I can just npm run, I guess I'll just node modules .bin webpack dev server. The only reason I'm prefixing this is because they're local files, right? Or they're local modules. I'll put progress on just so we can see what's going on. So when I run this, seeing the progress of it building. Now it emits and sits there, waiting on port, here we go, 8080, to serve these files for me. So now I'm able to actually access this without my production server, the one that has express static and all that. And what's cool about this is once I've got this set up, I can get my reloading, right? So I'm gonna go to my app JSX here and say, I don't know, something like, click this. Oh, there we go. And then I save it and it auto reloads, right? And I delete that, hit save, and it reloads. And that's part of that workflow that we want to have, is automatic feedback on what we're changing. So Webpack Dev Server is really good for that. It doesn't actually build anything in the build directory, so let me rm rf build. The files get copied to the build directory when I run just the Webpack command, not the Webpack Dev Server. So when I'm running Webpack Dev Server, it still builds the files, but it puts them in memory. And then when it updates the file, it updates it in memory, and it just makes things a little bit faster. So you'll see here lsla is going to give us no build directory there whatsoever, and I'd have to run Webpack again to actually have those files built for me. We can configure Webpack Dev Server. We would just do that in our configuration here for Webpack. You can actually add another option. I'll make this bigger. You can add another option down at the end here maybe, dev server, and this would be all the configuration for your dev server, including perhaps the port you want to run on. Say port 3000 instead. So now when I run the dev server, we're going to see that it actually switched over to use port 3000 instead. I recommend configuring dev server here makes sense to me. Okay, so that's dev server. Oh, and for anyone running in a virtual using a virtual machine, using any sort of cross-network environment like that, you might need to add watch options like this. Actually, most likely you will. And so you would just do, for the dev server, our watch options are 1, polling every 1 second. So that means it's constantly checking to see if your files have changed, because we can't actually send file system events over from the virtual machine to your host. Aggregate timeout is basically if you try saving a bunch of times quickly, that it will not rebuild a bunch of times. It will wait 300 milliseconds before rebuilding the one time. And then ignored, we don't need to rebuild anything in node modules. It's already built for us. So don't even watch files in there, and that actually might prevent crashes when you're using Webpack in the virtual machine. Some people run into this, some don't, but it always makes sense to ignore that type of stuff. And actually, to be fair here, we should probably also exclude node modules from our JSX compilation, because it's going to take a lot longer if it has to rebuild everything. But everything that comes from downloaded and installed modules should already have been transpiled for us. When you go look at the code that gets installed, it should be ES5 only. So we'll exclude node modules. Okay. The entry point here is client.js index.js. It will not go above it. Yeah, it will not go above that folder, unless something depends on something above that folder. Like if that happened, yeah, but it's not. But it's the node module. I'm not actually including anything from the build directory in my source code, right? So it will not find anything in there. Where I am including things from node modules, but that's why I'm excluding them, so it doesn't actually doesn't transpile any of the stuff in node modules. There should be no JSX files in node modules. Shouldn't exist. They should have been transpiled already, put into a dist directory, and that's what you end up using. Okay. So we got the dev server running. The other thing that we might want is in sources here, by default, we actually have a source map. And we can see that here's my current app. If I wanted to debug this, it's actually a little bit hard to see what's going on here. So I'm going to use a different source map. And I'm going to configure that in here. It's actually called the dev tool. I don't know why they did call it dev tool instead of source map. And here we give it a string and the option. Well, lots of different options. Webpack dev tool. We look at the Webpack documentation for this. And there's this table over here that's kind of cool. Shows, this has grown. I think there were about 7 of these before when I started doing this, and now there's more like 14 of them. These are different options, and they come with pros and cons. Those pros and cons include the speed at which it builds, the speed at which it rebuilds, whether or not it's good for production or not, and the quality of the code that we actually get to use and read. And so no dev tool, fast builds, fast rebuilds. It's good for production, but we get bundled code as our source map. We've got eval, fast build, fast rebuild. Do not use that in production, and you get generated code. Okay. What about original source? That's what I really want to be working with. And I don't care if it's okay for production because I'm in development mode. The build speed, I'm going to take a hit on that, but rebuilds will be okay. And so I think eval source map is the one that I want to use for my source map here. So I'm going to just put that as my option. I'll say the dev tool is eval source map. And so now when I rebuild with Webpack Dev Server, it's also going to rebuild this source map for me. And when I take a look at this file here, or this code, all right, I changed the port 8080. Okay, I go look under Webpack here, click down, go to my client directory, go to JS app.js. Oh, that's looking a lot nicer. All right. That's actually now what I get to debug with. Even though we know the source code that the browser's reading doesn't look like this, I get to use that source map to set a breakpoint here, reload this, and actually debug my code in my source map with the original source. Hugely powerful. So for development, I recommend eval source map. Okay. That covers the 2 development things that I wanted to talk about. That's the web server and the dev tool, or the source map. Production, another little piece that we might want to take into consideration here. We could at the top here say that our environment is equal to process.env.node-env, or by default, development environment. So I kind of like to do that. I'm going to say that my mode is now environment, whatever that is. It's production or development in my case. And so the way that I could run this now in production is I could say that my node environment is production when I run this. That'll change the mode here, which actually does a few things for us. One of the things is it minifies our code. The output that we get at the end is going to be, there's not going to be any line breaks, there's not going to be any spaces, it's going to shorten function names and stuff like that, perhaps. The other thing that we might want, or that it might do, is actually strip code out. So React in development, maybe it's a megabyte in size, and it has a whole bunch of output and warnings and things like, you didn't put key on that element, but you should. In production, none of that exists. It doesn't care about that in production. You should have figured that out in development. And so it strips all that code out to bring your bundle size down. What we want to do here is use this environment variable and say that we've got this other type of source map here. It's a cheap source map, and a cheap source map is good for production. So I'm going to say if my env is equal to production, then my source map will be, then my source map will be cheap source map. Otherwise, I'll use eval source map. And so when I build my assets for development, it'll build a development source map. And when I build them for production, it'll build the production source map. Now, the way that this works is I would have to say node env equals production. Then I run node modules.bin webpack. So I'm basically just saying I'll set this environment variable and I'll run webpack. And so for the runtime of this webpack, our environment will be production. I run it. And the way that we're going to find that this worked, hopefully, is that in our build directory, in our JS here, we actually have this file. That looks different than what I had before. This is now minified. This is the production asset. Okay? I look in my package.json here. I've got this prod build. And what that does is it sets the environment variable production for me. And it runs webpack with the progress and a -p flag. And -p is going to take this node environment and use it to maybe shrink our React library. So -p, I think, does two things. One, it defines our node environment for our client code. And two, it minifies. Without the -p, it won't do those things for us, I don't think. Maybe it does now. Yeah, no, actually, things are changing. This is taken over for that -p, the mode. So this is kind of, I kind of have to go back to Webpack every time they read this new version. I have to kind of read up, watch maybe a presentation from them on it, just to kind of get updated. And one of the big updates they had was you can now set the mode since version 4 in here. And if this mode is production, that's when it will minify your code for you. Okay. So I could now run npm run prod build, and that's going to build my production version. And if I run npm run dev build, that would build my development version. And I just use package scripts for that. That is it for the production stuff. You would just do this throughout. You would say, you know, so for example, here, maybe I only want to extract my CSS in production, not in development. So I would only run this plugin in production. How would I do that? Maybe I would say that this is actually my config. My config equals this object. And at the end, I module.exports my config. Well, what's great about this is I can now say config.plugins.push. I'm only pushing the CSS extract plugin at the end. And if env is equal to development. Oops. So now this only runs that extract plugin in development mode, right? And the reason we might want to do this is because sometimes we've got this thing called hot reloading, which I don't really need to get into. But hot reloading doesn't really work well with a separate CSS file. So if we want hot reloading development, we would just have our CSS in a module. And then when we actually run the production version, it would build it, extract it for us. The other thing we would have to do here is just switch this over from here and say, if the env is equal to development, then use style loader here. Otherwise, use mini CSS plugin for the production version. So we can kind of configure this based on the environment we're running it in. Very powerful stuff here. Okay, let's make sure this still works. And so my development version, that's a good question. What's going on here? I'm not sure. Oh, That's why. I got one more thing to show you, hopefully. There we go. So in development, I have my style tag here. And if I run the prod build version, I run my server, now it actually includes the CSS tag instead. So that's like one of the examples of what we could do with that. Last thing I want to show you is actually the bundle analyzer plugin. So we're going to see that when we run the development version, so I'm going to do a dev build here, including my app.js file, which is 1.79 megabytes, I guess. That's not that bad. I see them get up to about 10 megabytes with a lot of final projects. That's big. Doesn't matter for development, but you do not want to be serving to your customers a 10 megabyte JavaScript file. So one of the things we do, first off, is we run a prod build, right? And when we do a prod build, then that same file goes down, that's better, 99 kilobytes, okay? I don't have a lot in here, though. Chances are, if you were to do this from a 10 megabyte file, you're probably going to go down to about a megabyte. Still pretty big. If it's 2 or 3 megabytes, it's definitely way too big. And we want to figure out why it's so big, what files or what libraries might be causing it to grow in size. And so we've got this thing called a bundle analyzer plugin. And this will let us, if we install this, it'll actually allow us to kind of dive into our module that we've created and see what file or what projects or what packages are big. I actually, one time I added the Amazon Web Services library, which is, I think, about 3 megabytes of JavaScript. I only needed 2 functions from it. And I used the bundle analyzer plugin. It found out that it was so big that I was able to remove it, just add 2 functions in and save myself like 3 megabytes as a result of that. So I'm going to go to top here, bundle analyzer plugin is require the Webpack bundle analyzer plugin. And unfortunately, this one's a little bit different. We have to actually grab this out of it. I guess we could do that. That would work too. Okay, so we've got this bundle analyzer plugin. I'm just going to add it to the end of the bundle end of the bundles here. And now when I build, this is what I get from it. It says here that React, here's the size, here's how big it would be if it was gzipped. This is development mode, so that's why it's a little bit bigger. So React DOM is the largest library in my project right now. The React library, it's smaller for sure. Style loader, that's taken up about 13 kilobytes. FBJS, that's probably Facebook JavaScript library, taking about 12K. Prop types taking 3K. I don't know. All the stuff in here, Merriweather, all that stuff, that's kind of what we're seeing over here. There's the size of Merriweather. All the stuff that's in my dependency graph is listed here. And so you could use this to try and figure out which packages are too big. Take them out, maybe replace them with smaller ones. There's all sorts of things like code splitting and creating modules of just with your vendor packages or your imported packages. Lots of things you do with this. You don't need to worry about that right now. You don't need to worry about it for your final project. These things are being deployed, but they're not going to be used by millions of users on 3G mobile devices. So we're a little less worried about that. But if you do need to have a good experience for your user, do not send them a JavaScript file bigger than 200 kilobytes. It doesn't. That's sort of my cutoff. Okay. Thanks for taking the extra time. I would say, a little sad here. I built a boilerplate. You could take this, you could use it for your own if you wanted to. But I think you'd be able to extend it and make it yours, right? And that's sort of what I wanted to get to. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Calgary. Message me if you want, if you have any questions, Calgary. I know we kind of went over a lot there. I don't expect anyone to go and just build it now, build their own thing now. But if you do have questions about it, if you have your own configuration you're having trouble with, let me know. I'll be around for a bit today.